A very warm welcome to a pioneering event here at COP26 in Glasgow. It's week 2, the final week of the event in what is a critical summit. Now, we've had the positive headlines on global efforts to curb deforestation, trillions of dollars pledged from banks and financial giants into green finance projects. But this week, the real work starts, and today, a milestone in uniting 2 great goals for protecting our planet, gender and climate. It is truly impressive here at COP26 that action to protect our planet embraces both climate and gender. Today marks the launch of the Gender Smart Climate Finance Guide. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's an important one, co-developed by the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and CDC Group, on behalf of the 2X Gender and Climate Task Force. Now, we're going to be hearing from those organisations in just a moment. But first, let's take a little look at what the toolkit looks like in action. So, a snapshot of what real impact investing looks like and how people are using it today and applying both a climate and gender lens. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Dolika Banda, non-executive director on the board of CDC Group and one of the organisations behind this initiative to kickstart this exciting event today. Dolika, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chiyo. It is with great pleasure that I join this team today and that we welcome everybody to the launch of the Gender Smart Climate Finance Guide. This was issued by the 2X Gender and Climate Finance Task Force. It is clear that gender responsiveness and climate finance must be done intentionally and can deliver great economic gains. This is an initiative to leverage the power of gender-smart investment for climate action and has been heavily championed by CDC Group CEO, Nico Donohoe. So what is behind the toolkit? This is a joint effort that exemplifies partnership working for people and planet. You will hear from the other partners, but I'm primarily representing the voice of CDC Group. For those of you who are not too familiar with us, CDC is a development investment arm of the UK government. It is 100% owned by UK government, therefore the UK taxpayer. CDC invests in emerging markets with a particular focus on Africa and South Asia. It has invested with a particular focus on, in the last 70 years, in these two regions. Some examples. CDC was instrumental in setting up the private equity fund model in our emerging markets. CDC was one of the founding fathers of Kenya's fintech breakthrough, M-Pesa. In Asia, CDC in 2018 was the sole financier behind Ayana, a renewables platform that is succeeding and growing and is so apt for today. As we formally launch this, it is yet another first, a first in partnership with our colleagues EIB and EBRD in the 2X Challenge Collaborative. So what is the problem we're solving for with this toolkit? The toolkit will help us demystify the risk and highlight the opportunity of investing in women. I do not, for example, see male-owned businesses referred to as an asset class. The toolkit should lead us to shift this mindset such that women and business become ubiquitous as an asset and not an asset class on the balance sheet. The 2X Collaborative with our colleagues recognizes women's roles and entrepreneurs, leaders, employees, consumers, and in today's language, influencers. The guide will provide extensive guidance, tools, and analysis, as well as relevant case studies that will help us support and help investors to identify opportunities and mitigate risks in gender, as well as the nexus where gender and climate come together. The guide will finally include sector-specific and thematic guidance notes to help us all mainstream gender in our climate finance investments. As we meet here today, the guide is already making waves in the financial community. In this hour, it is being announced by the co-chair of the 2X Challenge, Jessica Espinoza, at the High-Level Gender Day Presidency event. So why now? And why is this gender and climate nexus so important? Some 3 statistics. The 50-50 statistic. By 2050, the date at which we will need to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 50% of the global population will be women. The 2/3 statistics. 2/3 of households today are run and influenced by women. And my third one, the 80-90 statistic. Women are disproportionately affected by climate change. 80 to 90% of women will be affected by climate-related disasters and chronic climate change. So what is the role of women? Women are critical agents of change, driving the transition to low-carbon and resilient economies. Through their various roles, women are driving the transition to net zero and resilient economies. For example, women entrepreneurs are more likely to start businesses with a sustainability focus. Gender diversity in companies, and particularly on boards, correlates with better management of risks, including climate risk. And thirdly, statistics show that women influences 80% of purchasing power globally. With those statistics, it is clear that we cannot meet the SDGs and limit global heating to 1.5 degrees, nor deliver on gender equality with the current volume of financing flows. Climate finance must increase. Furthermore, we now have a definition of a gender-smart climate finance investment that dignifies and exemplifies that it is Paris-aligned, one important fact, and that it meets the 2X collaborative guidelines and financing criteria. In closing, the case for investing in women as leaders of climate solutions is clear. We now have the first of its kind gender and climate investor toolkit that supports investors in doing this. I would like to leave you with some calls to action, 2 calls to action. The first call to action: women are both disproportionately affected by climate change, but also disproportionately form part of the solution. Through the work of the African Risk Capacity, for example, of which I was CEO for 3 years, and who are at this COP event today, it is shown that an insurance-based recovery delivered within 90 days can eradicate the negative impacts of drought, sadly, the response is often uninsured, mistargeted, and slow. The call for action is therefore the business case for investing in women and climate change resilience solution is clear. The time is now. Please visit the 2X Collaborative website and use the toolkit. Call number 2, my final call. Climate finance must increase, particularly in developing economies. And this climate finance must be gender responsive, as explicitly recognized in the Paris Agreement. This will deliver both business and essential impact returns. Please check out CDC's recent investments, Green Growth Equity Fund in India and Green Light Planet in Kenya, both of which are 100% climate finance and 2X gender qualified. The toolkit should lead us to shift the mindset, as I mentioned earlier, that women and business are becoming ubiquitous as an asset and not an asset class. In closing, I leave this podium today as a carrier of a message from the woman in my global circle, my mothers, my grandmothers, my sisters, my nieces, all imploring, speak for us, speak for planet and people, speak for women. Thank you, Chiyo.
A crystal clear and engaging and vibrant message. Thank you, Dolika. Making green finance work harder, you just explained why and how. Thank you indeed. Now, what does gender smart climate investment really look like? How does it work? And why is it important? Let's take a look at how Responsibility Investments, a leading Swiss sustainable asset manager supported by the EIB, commits to apply a gender lens to all its investments through one of its climate funds. Let's take a look.
Responsibility is a sustainable asset manager that focuses on emerging markets and on the most impactful topics of our time, from climate finance to gender equality. 2X Challenge investments make a difference by encouraging and supporting companies, especially in emerging markets, in their ambition to empower women and to enhance their economic participation. EIB is a key shareholder in several of our climate funds, and as a 2X Challenge member, they have been enthusiastic supporter of responsibility in our initial gender analysis of the climate portfolio. And now we have signed a memorandum of understanding which describes how we will incorporate gender smart practices in our climate finance investment process in future. One of our investees is a company who provides solar home systems in markets where people don't have access to the grid. And through this, they improve the lives of over 100 million people and offset more than 23 million tons of CO2 emissions. This is done in over 70 countries. They have now recently committed themselves to achieve full gender equality in their work staff by 2030, in line with the Sustainable Development Goal number 5. To achieve this goal, they have worked on a dedicated roadmap and strategy. We have now supported them via a technical assistant project, which has the goal to operationalize the more difficult aspects of this gender equality strategy. Data from IFC has shown that more diverse management teams actually have improved decision-making process, enhanced governance, and the better ability to tap into larger markets by serving a more diverse customer group.
So a really good example of how climate and gender investment makes good business and economic sense. Now, I'm keen to begin today's discussion and delighted to introduce our panel. First up, Anita, Bhatia, joining us virtually. We got there in the end, always a technical problem, but we've resolved it. Today, Anita joins us. She's UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director at UN Women. Dolika, we've already introduced. She's joining and listening into our discussion. Ambroise Fayolle, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Welcome. And to Barbara Rambousek, Director for Gender and Economic Inclusion at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome. I'm very happy to introduce Vladislav Kaim, our youth voice, UN Youth Advisor on Climate Change. Welcome. Now, I'd like to begin with Anita. You're here with us virtually, but you are in the same room. Anita, your role at UN Women requires a gender focus 24/7. Now, when it comes to investing, what does a gender lens mean? What does it look like to you? And do you think today's guide will make a difference?
Thank you very much. And first, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Great to be with all of you, and really wonderful to see Dolika and Ambroise after all these years. Makes me think back to our time together at the World Bank Group. First, let me just say, I think it's great that we have a special day set aside at COP, which is focusing exclusively on gender. And I'm really happy that we're having this discussion on that day. And I want to go straight to the question you asked on the guide, and then I'll come back to the broader question of what gender lens investing means for us. So first, on the guide, huge congratulations to EBRD and to CDC for putting this together, because this whole area of work on climate finance really needs to be supported by standard setting, by tools, by instruments, and by good examples of how to make things work. So I really want to say huge congratulations in taking the lead on producing this. I think this very practical tool has the potential to be a real game changer, because it fills an existing gap in gender responsive climate finance in general. But I think more importantly, it provides some guidelines to tap into the very large pool of ESG interested assets that are out there, but don't yet know how to do gender sensitive climate finance. From UN Women's perspective, having a gender lens actually means a number of things. So first of all, it means thinking about how policy instruments of the state in particular can be developed in such a way that they are actually driving finance towards women and where women are beneficiaries of that finance. That means having standards like the ones that have just been discussed, but also it means ensuring that there is capacity building for bringing about that behavior change. It means taking a different look at what risk means and understanding more deeply what is the risk associated with driving finance towards women. We have plenty of examples and plenty of empirical evidence which shows that women are not a credit risk. In fact, women can be better credit risks than other populations, and yet they are not recipients of as much finance as other populations. So how do you change that? It means thinking about risk, but it also means going back to thinking about how principles that benefit women and girls were developed. Did these principles benefit from the voices of beneficiaries, from discussions with women's groups, with discussions with grassroots organizations? And did it benefit from a deep understanding of that missing middle, which always finds it difficult to get finance? And finally, it does require much deeper analytical work on thinking about the intersection between climate and gender, because while each of those is well understood, that nexus is still something that is work in progress. Last word on gender lens investing, it is not an end in itself. It really is a tool to drive the achievement of SDG 5, and through it, as the docking lever for all other SDGs, it really is about implementing the decade of action and putting us on a path to Agenda 2030. Thanks, and back to you.
Thank you, Anita. So, Ambroise, I'd like to turn to you. Anita is telling us a game changer really, but also, not something in itself, it is a toolkit. Tell us why the EIB is supporting gender smart climate finance, and is there actually a business case for it?
Thank you, Chiyo. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to reconnect with Anita, even with a distance. But it was a pleasure working with her. We're back in my years at the World Bank, and I must say that you've remained sharp and clear, Anita. I just would like to start with an anecdote. I had the honor and privilege to serve many years under a great woman who is Christine Lagarde. And Christine, I was especially working with her during the financial crisis, the one that we had between 2009 and 13-14. And at the time, she was interviewed about the lessons that she had learned from the Lehman Brothers crisis. And her answer was, well, had it been Lehman Sisters, the story would have been different. And I think it tells a lot about why gender is so important in our strategy. And the strategy of all institutions actually present here, being CDC or EBRD or the UN, obviously. So for us, we are the climate bank of the European Union. We are also representing the financial arm of the EU. So the priorities of the EU are necessarily our priorities. And actually, both gender and climate are two key priorities for the European Union. And that's why we have started to embark on both legs, if I may say so. Clearly the leg on gender, with some 1.9 billion euros that have been implemented as gender lens projects. We are ahead actually of what we had in mind, and I'll give a few examples probably later on about what we do. And we were the first MDB to join the 2X challenge. Very pleased to have done that. It's really something that corresponds to the EU priority, the EU action plan, and we are really committed to this. But beyond that, there is the issue of climate change. And actually, Anita is right. The nexus between climate change and gender looks pretty clear. We know that women are those who are actually, you said that, Dolika, the most vulnerable to climate change. Need probably indeed some more data but intuitively you see that these challenges are big and need to be addressed. The fact that in Africa in particular, most entrepreneurs are female entrepreneurs. That also means that for economic development, dealing with climate change, you have also the best prospect to have a better life if you deal together with entrepreneurship and climate change at the same time. So for us, as I said, impact is very important. We want to finance projects that have an impact, and we think the 2X initiative is exactly going in a direction that will increase the impact of what we finance, because it targets women who have also a bigger impact on the projects that we finance.
So the true impact there, you've laid it quite clearly. Thank you, Ambroise. Barbara, I'd like to turn to you. Now, how would you describe the last decade in terms of looking through the gender lens at the bank? And has the pandemic changed your focus at all?
Thank you very much, Chiyo, and I'm delighted to be here as well. I think this is a very important moment for all of us to come together at the end of a very strong and fruitful collaboration. But if we look back at the last 10 years, I think we've all been on a very long journey here. I think all of us started to look at gender and the impact that our investments can have on gender, what gender lens investment actually means across different sectors. And then started to also look at what does climate change mean in relation to gender, what does digitalization, regionalization, urbanization, all these sort of big challenges that we face globally, what do they actually mean in relation to gender equality and the other way around? And then the pandemic hit. And I think it caught us all clearly by surprise. And I remember some were saying at the time, oh, this is a crisis now, you know, we come back to gender in 2 years, but now we have to deal with the crisis. But there was then actually very soon a realization that you can't deal with the crisis if you also don't deal with gender equality. So gender equality is part and parcel. It has to be core of any crisis response, really. So building gender in is not an add-on at the end. It has to really be core and central to what we do, and that goes for climate change, that goes for the post-COVID recovery, that goes for tackling other challenges. So in a way, this nexus, if we come back to the question of climate change and gender, this nexus is a very natural one. I think we need to move away from looking at gender separately and climate change separately and then finding sort of links. We need to understand that if you want to tackle climate change credibly, you have to tackle inequality. And that gender equality lies at the heart of that. So the two are intrinsically interlinked. They are two sides of the same coin, and therefore any responses need to include both. So at EBRD, we actually have seen a huge increase in the number of gender projects that we have from 2020 to 21 by over 150%. We now have over a third of all of our investments having a very strong gender component. We've invested over 10 billion euros in projects that have a gender component. And at the same time, we are also at almost 50% of all our investments that are green and have made a commitment to Paris align all our investments by 2023 anyway. So we really are able to marry those two things together. And I think the guide that we are launching today is a nice way of bringing that together across so many different sectors.
Really interesting, Barbara, hearing about the momentum in those sort of gender-driven climate projects. Vladislav, I'm going to move to you now. We hear billions, even trillions, being pledged here at COP26 to help hard-hit nations cope with climate change. As part of the youth voice here, I'm very keen to know, are you optimistic or pessimistic about these pledges? How do you feel?
To be completely honest, pledges, especially when they are announced to the tune of trillions, especially due to the way those trillions are calculated in such pledges, are rather cheap, at least at the moment, I have to say that. Because ultimately what matters is what is in the pledge and what is beyond the pledge. What matters is the plan of how you leverage and deploy the assets you pledge. Whether you have a short-term, medium-term plan for how you actually leverage them and what are the deliverables, and what is the concrete pathway in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end of how you actually leverage them. This is why it is extremely important to go beyond the headlines. It is extremely important to understand that the work that is being done in this particular topic at COP26 is only a start. And the process of assuring a gender-just climate finance sphere is a marathon, not a sprint. And for us to be able to run this marathon in a way that will help young girls and women who have to deal with the consequences of climate change on equal footing with men, it is extremely important to monitor what is in the pledges and beyond the pledges, so that we would be able to hold the industry players actually accountable and not to rely on their opening narratives on how we could hold them accountable.
So Anita, I'd like to turn to you. We've heard a marathon, not a sprint. Now, how do you ensure, in your view, that these huge, vast sums of money being pledged, promised to be mobilized, land where it's most needed and target the most vulnerable, i.e. women?
So I think Vladimir makes a really good point on pledges being just pledges, and that you really have to see how the rubber hits the road. And when I just put two numbers in perspective, I think it's really it reveals how far we have to go. So earlier in 2020, earlier this year, we actually had a major forum in Paris hosted by France and the government of Mexico. And this was our Generation Equality Forum. And we had a number of important institutions who joined us for this forum, including EBRD, which really made very important pledges during this forum, which was about how do you drive financing towards gender equality. So when you look at the billions that were mobilized there, which was 40 billion, believe me, we are still chasing that 40 billion to ensure that it really does land where it is supposed to land, which is to foster gender responsive finance. So I think if we are serious about converting pledges, first of all, I do think we need to continue to do work that makes it easier to drive that money. So when you look at the world of ESG investing, and we're very focused on this right now in UN Women, what is very noticeable is that SDGs for health, SDG for climate, and others have managed to attract quite a bit of finance, still very small, and still mostly not in emerging markets, mostly in developed markets. But actual finance for SDG 5 is really small, really a very small percentage of overall ESG investing. So how do we change that? So very soon, UN Women, together with IFC and the International Capital Markets Association, will be launching next week, actually, something called Gender Bond Guidelines, which is basically adapting and refining social bond guidelines so that they have a gender lens. And we hope that this will lead to the creation of a new asset class, which is gender bonds. And of course, we want countries and sovereigns to think about this in a very responsible way, where they have fiscal space and where they may have a borrowing program that has already been agreed with their parliaments, we are encouraging countries to think about how, if they're going to go to the market, can they do this with a gender and ideally a climate lens as well. So we need more tools, guidelines, standards, and policy instruments to drive that. But then the other thing we need, and actually Ambroise reminded me of this when he mentioned Christine Lagarde's name, is we need more attention to governance structures and whether or not women have a role in decision-making and whether women are at the table when decisions are being made that actually influence their lives. So I think we need to pay attention both to standards and instruments, as well as to governance, leadership, and decision-making.
Anita, thank you. So governance, very important. It's more than just an investment. Ambroise, I'd like to turn to you. As a climate banker here on the panel today, how do you work with partners and projects that focus on gender and improving the outcomes for women?
Look, we have adopted last year what we call the Climate Bank Roadmap. And the Climate Bank Roadmap is a combination of targets that are quantitative to increase significantly the volume of activity that we do under climate, and to increase significantly the quality of the projects we intend to do. So the two key targets, I won't be long on that, but the two key targets are to move from 25% of what we do to 50% of our climate and environment financing of the total projects that we finance by 2025. And all our projects are now Paris aligned since January 21. And we have presented here two things. The first one is on the Paris alignment of our counterparts. So basically, what do you do for a project that is clearly a green project presented by a company that is clearly not Paris aligned? And the other project that we have produced here is an adaptation plan. For the first time, actually, an adaptation is also clearly linked to the role of women. The adaptation plan with a true ambition to increase significantly the volume of adaptation projects we do especially in developing countries. And so through this climate bank roadmap, and in this climate bank roadmap, it's clear that we have defined the provision of gender responsive climate finance as a key priority area for us. And again, it is not a surprise. It corresponds to our DNA. It corresponds to the DNA of the European Union. So this is clearly a target for us, and also we think it is good business also, because we are convinced that the projects that are indeed have a gender lens in the way we appraise them have a better chance to be successful. The way we are trying to work on this, and we try to implement this gender lens, is I would just give two examples. One is we are trying to support the clients who are targeting women's employment and leadership opportunities. So it can go indeed through governance, but it can go also through through advisory and technical assistance, how we can do the job. And actually, Stefan in responsibility and the initiative that was presented was also clearly in this direction. And the other one is trying to lend to women entrepreneurs and to lend to women entrepreneurs and fund managers that are active in climate. And that's what we also are trying to develop. It's important also actually in many areas, but including sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture. We have a lot of projects there, and we are very encouraged by the success of an initiative that we launched in 2019, which is called She Invest. That initiative that we have launched in Africa. Basically, this is credit lines to local banks, but local banks who are targeting increasing access to credit for female entrepreneurs. And the success of this initiative has been huge. We thought it would be difficult to reach the 1 billion target we had. After 1 year we had, with projects in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Senegal, in Benin, all across Africa. And since then, what we have decided is to double the amount in 2020, so to do 2 billion euros in additional lending to She Invest, which will mobilize gender responsive investment that are 2X compliant, and this is also why it is pertinent here. And that's, for me, that's the sign that really what we do is trying to put gender at the center of what we do. I completely agree with you, actually, on the fact that it has to not to be parallel. It is the same issue that you see in the different angles, and very pleased that it works well. I hear Anita about the gender bonds. I think this is something that we could indeed have a look at.
So exciting outcomes there. Now, Barbara, we've been hearing about how you and your partners are successfully uniting gender and climate. I'm interested to know, will this approach be mainstream, do you think? How do you get your message out to the wider world?
Thank you very much, Chiyo. So I think gender mainstreaming, or maybe call it the full integration of gender across our investments, is very much at the heart of our strategies. In fact, we are actually about to launch a new gender strategy for EBRD at the end of the month. It's really about making sure that whatever we do, be it investing in green cities and looking at green infrastructure, to make sure that women are part of the decision-making process and are around the table, are part of deciding what kind of infrastructure, how it is designed, how it is operated, so it works for their needs as well. It is about entrepreneurship, and we've heard the example from the EIB just now, where we also work across 10 different countries, actually equipping women with the skills and access to finance to invest in green technologies. It's about renewables, it's about new emerging sectors, making sure women have access to the green skills and green jobs, so that they can actually participate and share in the opportunities that are created from a green economy transition. So it's about working with our clients to see women as an untapped market segment, both in terms of lending to women entrepreneurs, in terms of marketing products to women, but also just making their services more accessible to everybody. So I think that really is about building the business case, making that business case, and increasingly, I really have to say, we see a lot of interest from our clients across all sorts of different sectors. It's no longer just good enough to put your product on the market. You have to do it in a way where you are seen as a responsible corporate citizen, and that includes a focus on green, and it also includes a focus on inequality, and in particular on gender equality. So I think we're all in a way going in the same direction here, and as financiers, we very much try to further this or accelerate the speed of this transition.
Thank you. And Vlad, I'd like to know from you, so how do you think that youth can contribute to making the gender smart and climate toolkit relevant so it doesn't just end up gathering dust on a bookshelf?
First of all, I think youth are already doing that, but they are also the constituency that is looked with the biggest suspicion by the finance community. We often hear, and this is particularly a problem for the projects that are led by young women, that from bigger financial institutions and development institutions, they often hear this phrase that personally drives me nuts when I say their project lacks bankability. But bankability as a notion, when it comes in general in the development of finance, is precisely why we are in the climate crisis, because what was ingrained in the notion of bankability contained a system of incentives that contributed to the destruction of natural capital, to the destruction of human capital through that, again, with biggest burden falling on young women. So I think it is also time to paradigmatically reverse this and lend a hand to young women who are out there and are extremely entrepreneurial, regardless of whether they're having a green business of their own or if they're doing community adaptation projects and whatnot, and to actually help them at the smaller scale, but with much greater precision than announcing those great pledges and investing greater amounts in just in the search of scale, while the scale and the synergies are already there in their in the places where they live, in the communities where they work, and so on. And here I would also like to especially commend Barbara on mentioning green jobs as a person whose main topical mandate in the Youth Advisor Group is green jobs and just transition. It is extremely important to understand that investment in green jobs is one of the best adaptation investments we can make that is gender smart. Because we have seen, for example, how the STEM skills are important to get green jobs, and we see how many there are. In fact, the majority of STEM graduates, nearly in all of the countries, are female graduates. And we also see what an immense potential green jobs market opens for those who cannot access higher education, but who can go also through vocational education. And that pathway should be extremely accessible and open for young women as well. So I would like to leave it here.
Thank you, Vlad. I'd like to turn to Anita now. Vlad mentioned a very good point about just transition, jobs, skills. These are things that you can't ignore in this conversation. So, I mean, climate change, like the pandemic, it disproportionately impacted women, exposing inequalities in employment, skills, jobs, opportunities, access to healthcare, just to name a few. What are the underlying reasons for this, Anita?
Well, I would say the main reason that the pandemic exacerbated impacts for women is that there were structural inequalities to begin with. And what the pandemic did was make many of those existing structural inequalities much worse. But it also then shone a light on issues that UN Women had been talking about for a while, but had never been recognized as issues of public policy, really. And so let me flag one of those, while saying that what we saw during the pandemic were three main impacts on women: on income, on health, and on security. And security is actually a very good example of something that we knew had existed, but that just shot up exponentially during the pandemic. And that was the issue of violence against women. We have known, those of us who work on gender equality, for decades that this is a major issue in countries across the world, developed and emerging markets, but it really came to the fore during the pandemic, so much so that the Secretary General called it the shadow pandemic, the scourge of violence against women. But the other issue that really came to the fore during the pandemic was the whole issue of childcare and the care economy. And this is something that policymakers have simply not recognized yet, needs to be taken into account in the formulation of instruments and approaches that will allow women to properly participate in the workforce. But as a result of the pandemic, we have now seen that many governments have recognized, for example, the US recognized in its major American Family Act bill that they had to put in extra funding for childcare facilities, for parental leave, for insurance, for paid leave for women, because otherwise they would have what we are seeing around the world, which is a real drop in female labor force participation. So I mention all of this to say that the issues actually were not necessarily new, but that they really became very self-evident during the pandemic. I'll leave it at that.
Ambroise, that is a really interesting point. I mean, I heard an interesting comment here at COP, during COP. There are no green jobs. All jobs have to be green. Now, but there are also demands for a just transition to protect and to reskill workers. So just having a gender and climate lens and focus play a role here.
Look, we are clearly in a transition phase. We at EIB, we are convinced, and we are not alone there, that the transition will fail if it is not just. And a just transition was actually one of the very fundamental pillars of our strategy, and still is. And one of the reasons why the strategy was approved unanimously by our board, and our board is composed of all the member states of the European Union. They are in a very different situation on the way towards climate neutrality. And so there are very different ways to look at the just transition, but they are all very important. I am French. I know very well how excellent reforms that are put in place over several years can be destroyed in a few weeks because the just transition has not been enough in place. So I think it is something that we have to learn, how to support the transition for regions or countries that have much more to be supported to achieve their climate ambitions. And of course, female entrepreneurs and women and the 2X initiative is a part of that, is a big part of that. And I think everything we can do to make sure that we have the lens of social development and vulnerability more broadly, and that is also including more basically female having a say in that, is going to be helpful. And actually, the just transition will probably not be achieved, and probably not the true word, will not be achieved if we are not ensuring that women fully participate and benefit from the transition to a green economy. And let me just mention that I very much agree with Vlad about we need to ensure that the female workforce have a say and opportunity to invest further in STEM skills. And I'm pretty sure that STEM skills for women can significantly contribute not only to employment and increasing the labor skills shortage, but also to a better greening of the economy.
That's a very key point. Barbara, today you're celebrating a new chapter for 2X, for the gender climate nexus, the understanding of it. new guide and toolkit. But fast forward 5 years, I'd like to know, what progress would you like to see?
Thank you very much. What I would really like to see is those silos to disappear, you know, where gender and climate change are just one item and are one way of investing and become the way of investing, where it's not a special separate class or a special way of doing things, where it's the one and only acceptable way of doing things. And maybe if I just briefly come back to the point about just transition that we also heard a moment ago. I think the important thing is that there are so many different transitions happening. So we have the transition in terms of going towards the green economy, but we also have global value chains changing. We have regions really declining because tourism is disappearing because of COVID or maybe other reasons. We have whole industries shifting how they are allocated around the globe and around the regions that we work in. And all these things intersect and they all interlink. So I think we need to make sure that when we look at the just transition, we look at livelihoods, we look at people, we look at how the investments that we make, each and every single one of them, actually impacts on creating different types of jobs that are accessible to those whose livelihoods are in danger and are imperiled. Not just putting in big numbers, or we've created lots of jobs, job done. It is not. And this is also where the focus on gender equality comes in. How do women participate in this transition, the green economy transition, the regional transitions, and others? And how can we make sure that they have access to the green jobs, green skills, etc., that are needed?
Well, that's a great outlook for what you would like in 5 years' time. Vlad, I'd like to end with you. Now, some, including the World Economic Forum, have suggested that the climate change world is riven with toxic masculinity. Even storms are named after women because of the damage that they can wreak, and you know, people being less prepared for them. We know women are more likely to recycle, for example, more than men. Does this chime with the youth sentiment of today, Vlad? And if so, what will it take for young men to step up?
I think first and foremost, what would be required for young men in order to step up is to realize that when it comes to the risks and issues in the gender and climate space, it is not something abstract. It is something that, if we are not addressing it seriously, will come to the doorstep of our mothers, of our sisters, of our wives, girlfriends, of our colleagues, of all women and girls we hold dear for our lives. And do we really want to go all this way into to the abyss when we have, due to various structural factors, we have enormous advantages and privileges which, instead of perpetuating, we could actually put to a good cause, where we could actually use more privileged access to certain contacts, to certain networks, to financial resources, to bring them in those networks, to help the young women and girls to access the resources where they would be able to assure for themselves a future that is on their own terms, where climate risk is not a risk, where it's not a survival risk, where we together co-create a new model of coexistence with nature and with the new economic space. It is extremely important that we as young men make sure that we do not serve as gatekeepers, but that we open the door for our colleagues. We put that foot in the door and help them come in so they could smash that door down completely. This is what I like all of us, all in my position, to do and keep doing.
Vlad, powerful message there. Keep knocking the door. We want to hear your message carry through. So whatever you're doing, carry on doing it. I'd like to know, we may have Jessica Espinosa, who may join us for the end of the panel. We may not, but just let me introduce Jessica Espinosa, Vice President of Private Equity and Venture Capital Investments at DG KFC. She's also, KFW, the chair of the 2X Challenge. We'll hear from her another time, I'm sure. It's been excellent to hear about how 2X has progressed and mobilized and gained momentum. But today I just want to reflect on what we've heard from our panel today. I mean, collaboration, coexistence, synergy, optimism, and urgency. I mean, I hope we can just bring those together. But today, obviously, very important chapter for you, for the 2X, and for just understanding the nexus between climate and gender. To close this, I would like to, first of all, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel, our expert panel, Dolika from CDC Group, thank you. Dolika Banda. Anita, Bhatia, you've been very much with us, not in the room, but remotely, from UN Women. Ambroise, Fayolle, thank you for joining us. And it's lovely to hear about the French anecdotes and, you know, hearing from Christine Lagarde and what you've learned, and you know, it's inspiring. From the European Investment Bank, and Barbara Rambousek also, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And we were really happy that you could join us, Vlad, because I know that it was a real dash to get here. But you're the voice, the climate advisor to the UN, and thank goodness we have young people like you on board, is what I'd say. Now, I'm going to end because we're nearly at the end of this. The why is really clear. The why, 50% of the global population will be women. Dolika mentioned that. I'm going to reiterate that. Women disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and climate change, from skills, opportunities, jobs, access to healthcare. That needs to change. But the solution, this is very much about moving the debate forward and looking at what solutions we can have. Well, gender smart climate investing is definitely seems the way forward. And knowing that there are metrics, there are tools, there's a guidebook, there's data is a really positive step. And the proof, well, we've seen some of the case studies, we've seen the videos of how it's actually being used, how businesses are using it, how funds are using it in reality. But, you know, it's one of those things that I guess, Anita from UN Women, it's wonderful to have you on board. And every day I hear about another initiative, another announcement, moving this debate forward. So we're all eager to hear what comes next, what happens in 5 years' time. We hope it's just gender and climate are just one. We don't separate them. I would actually like to end this session with a quote that made me smile, because I think we do need positivity in this debate. We do need to lift our spirits. And I'm sure you've heard of the renowned conservationist Jane Goodall. Now, this quote of hers made me smile. "It doesn't take much to be considered a difficult woman. That's why there are so many of us." With that, thank you very much to our distinguished panel.